Right, so we'll start the talk here then. First, I would really like to thank Mary Davey for contacting me and asking me to consider doing this talk. When we talked about wildlife and she mentioned the River Otter, it is a place where I spend a lot of my time, and I thought that should be straightforward. When I came to start organising the shots to put into the talk, I suddenly realised there were actually far too many for a talk, really. So today, there are virtually no geese, very few ducks, and not very many small birds either, purely because of space. You'll see as we go along. And I've tried to select a whole range of things that would interest people from the novice absolute beginners through to the very much more experienced wildlife watchers. So the talk itself today, we'll start with mammals. Mary particularly asked me to include otters, so we'll start with those. Mary also asked me to talk a little bit about the East Budleigh Community Shop calendar. So that's something else that we get involved with. And here, I'm really trying to encourage the school children in the village to be a bit more aware of what wildlife lives so close to us and how to look for it. Because I've excluded a number of species, what I decided to do was pick images that have appeared in past, present, and next year's calendar from those species that aren't actually in the calendar in the talk this evening. That will include the polecats, which it's astonishing how many people now know about those polecats, but I'll tell you the story about how I come to take the photographs, a couple taken before and a couple taken after. Now, the main body of my talk is all about birds. We start with raptors, so these are birds of prey. So as a brief warning, there will be a few midsummer murders in amongst this presentation. We won't dwell on them long, but birds of prey have to eat too. And then the bulk of the rest of the talk is about birds that live either on or near water, but with a few exceptions as well. And time permitting, we'll finish up with some insects that have been seen in the area as well. So without further ado and any more chatting from me, let's start talking about otters. So when we retired to the area over 10 years ago, lovely part of East Devon, and I find within walking distance, I've got a river called the River Otter. Really intriguing to go down there and try and find an otter. And you go and you go and you go and you go and you go, and you really don't get much luck. So you start looking for signs of otters, and sure enough, you find footprints, you find spraint, but you see no otters. And it probably took me over 2 years before I first got my otter sighted. And then slowly you realize that it is a shy, secretive creature, and you've got to pay attention to a lot more things than you would expect for much other wildlife. So how do we know an otter footprint? Well, let's see how that works. Is that way? So here we've got the footprint of a dog down in the sand by the side of the river, and you can clearly see 4 pads and the hind pad. That's because it's got a dew claw up on its pad as well. When we compare that to an otter, very distinctly different, a 5-padded footprint. Now, if you were to go down there looking for them, don't expect hundreds of them. There are hundreds of dogs, but there aren't hundreds of otters. And dogs are potentially a predator as far as the otter is concerned. So we'll try and leave tracks and spraint in places where dogs are less likely to find it, so less likely to know it's there. All right. Otter spraint, something else to look out for. It's generally in a prominent position, never in a black polythene bag, and will have a selection of bones and fish scales and things amongst it. I'm told by genuine enthusiasts that it's not unpleasant to smell. I haven't been that curious. I've left that to others to decide for me. This photograph was taken about the middle of February, and just down in here is where the otter had a halt and where she brought up a couple of young that year. Now, if you can imagine, within 4 to 6 weeks, vegetation growing up 2 or 3 or 4 feet from that height, and the water is quite deep, so the otter has a chance to either come out on the surface, just under the surface, or to dive left or right and go 10, 20, 50, 100 yards either way. You've really got to be switched on to try and see if an animal is there and what's happening to it. Then the first chance you might see of an otter is it's about to disappear. And when they disappear, they know how to do it pretty quickly. If you try harder and harder, you might eventually even see 3 disappearing. So that's the story of how my otter observation started. And then eventually with persistence, you manage to get an otter out in sight and it doesn't actually see you. This particular individual had caught a fish and it turned round looking away from me. I think it was worried I might steal the fish. It decided then, when it had finished the fish, to turn round, look at me and poke its tongue out. So I took a photograph of it. And we'll just go through a number of photos of otters. This is an adult female with 2 virtually fully grown youngsters that are now out in the open in the evening sunshine, which happens very, very rarely for me. Here we've got an otter with a very large eel, and even though it's got a vice-like grip behind its head, that otter was really struggling. I estimated the diameter of the eel's body was probably about the same as my wrist, so it was a very big meal. And unfortunately, the otter just dived in under that bramble bush there and ate it and didn't show again for ages. That's just what happens sometimes. Here we've got an otter that has just caught a bullhead. Now, interestingly, this otter was out showing mid-morning, which I wouldn't normally expect. So I think she'd come out because she was hungry and she was feeding young quite close by. And then when things go your way, so there's no disturbance from anything, and that implies planes overhead, drones, people, all sorts, the otter might come out and show itself, and providing you're the right side of the wind, it doesn't catch scent of you, you can get a few nice photos. This one dived and then came up, and it's actually crunching something. I'm not sure whether it was crunching a freshwater mussel or a snail or something, but it was definitely some sort of invertebrate with a shell. It's about as close as I've had an otter come to me, and this was about 5 feet from me. And I really felt privileged to get that shot. This is one of the youngsters. So this particular year, the adult female had 2 young. One I called the shy, nervous one, and this was the curious, confident one. And I just sort of crawled upriver about 15 yards, made a bit of rustling amongst the vegetation, and it came up towards what the noise was, and I made a little squeak, and it stood up on its hind legs to have a look at me, which was really obliging of it. And here we have an otter out in the open, just having a look round. In fact, this is quite close to where the beavers were, and I do believe that an otter is potentially a serious predator for very young beaver kids. And here we have the beaver, so a very different animal, a strict vegetarian. It doesn't really have any interest in anything other than defending its young if something comes close to it. I've only put a few photos of this in because I understand you've all had a beaver talk more recently, but here's just a few shots of beavers. Here's Adam in a grooming situation. They tend to do all this behavior early in the morning or late in the evening when the light's not very good, so it's always a bit of a challenge to get a nice photograph of it. And here's a very young kid saying hello to its mum. And this is what a young beaver looks like when it first comes out of the burrow. And although some people love it, I would have to call this my Marmite moment. You either love it or you hate it. This is what it looks like. This is what it is, but it's useful because it shows both the front and the hind feet. It shows that its fur isn't really waterproof. It's not a very competent swimmer. So it would be highly vulnerable, I think, to an attack by an otter unless dad or mum or both are out there actively defending it. Compare that to a mink. So this is an adult male mink down by the mouth of the River Otter. I'm quite surprised that mink do still survive there. The otter is far bigger. It is the dominant predator, but one or two of the mink are shy and wary enough and sly enough, I guess, to survive. As far as I can tell, although they do attempt to breed, none of the young survive, so I think the otter takes those out, but there are a few mink around. And this is one of the females, so they do vary in colour quite a bit, but it is interesting that they are down there. Compared to the little weasel. Now, so if you see something with a very short tail that's no black in it at the end, and probably the body is about the diameter of a walnut. So an animal small enough to go down a mouse hole, that'll be a weasel. Compared to the stoat, a considerably bigger animal with its black brush on the end of its tail. Bit of a midsummer murder coming up. So here we've got a stoat. I think this was a juvenile animal that was just about learning to be independent, and it managed to come across what I think is a newly fledged juvenile dunnock. And it was so proud of what it had done that it didn't know whether to run towards me and show me or whether to run away. So I just froze and kept taking photographs, and it did come towards me. Here we've got a fox, and here it's found a nest full of young rabbits to take back to its young of its own. So I understand some rabbits now nest above ground rather than below because they've learnt that the flea that carries the myxomatosis virus more easily spreads below ground than above. But if you're above ground and a fox finds where your young are, it's game over. In young rabbit, just because I think it's helpful for people to be aware of the difference between rabbits and hares. So at a distance and in not very good light, it can be difficult, but actually they're quite different animals when you get details. And felt quite privileged when this animal, although it was wary, it was still prepared to risk eating while it knew I was there taking photographs of it. A few shots of rabbits just to get a little bit of action. And this is the sort of shot you might get of a hare if you're lucky. So it's crouched down in the long grass, and then it gently emerges up, and it's surprising how that might look like the top of a molehill or a bit of dead grass or something. You really got to be alert to see what the movement is and what it's doing. It's just checking you out. It's probably you're in the wrong position to the wind. It's caught your wind and your smell, and it's worrying what you're doing. Eventually, they will come out in the open. Now, this animal has actually heard my camera shutter, even though it's on silent, and it's wondering, what's that noise? I don't understand. Luckily, I'm well hidden in shaded vegetation, and so all I can do is gently keep the shutter going until it sees nothing else wrong, and it kind of accepts what it is. And it comes along a bit further, and then this was a lovely dewy morning. This is young, tender, full of sugar, spring barley, and it couldn't resist eating a lot of it, and it had a wet nose and wet chin, and I thought with a bit of luck we're going to get a shot of it licking its mouth, and that's the case. You can also see here that it is obviously suckling young, so this is a female hare. And this is how close the animals will get if they don't know you're around. Everything's going right, and the light is nice. And I mean, it really is a privileged to see a wild animal like this behaving naturally, and you will not get that if you try chasing around trying to frighten it. And we're very lucky close to us because hares are thriving, they're doing extremely well, and they're not difficult to get nice shots of. Moving on to roe deer, we've got several families of those in the area. Here's one just crossing a field of emerging field maize. The young fawn, now, when I wander around the fields, I have noticed, particularly because many of them are a little bit away from the river, are quite sandy, pebbly, poor soils, free draining. So they get thirsty, and they do know where every cattle trough is to get a drink. And you can see the prints of the adult deer as they come there to drink. One day I could see the tiny prints of a young fawn. And it took me about 6 weeks to, so the animal has grown quite a bit now, before I could actually work out where it was and get one or two nice shots of it. But really pleasing when you do. And then as they grow a little bit more, she generally has twins, particularly down by the river. Now this is 1 or 2 fields just behind Budley Cricket Club. I think she's very clever going down there because it's low-lying, it's fertile, tight to the south coast, sheltered from the prevailing southwesterly winds. So you get more or less the first flush of spring grass down there. And she knows it, and she's down there, and that's where she gives birth to her young. And then here's a little family group of them. And they're really quite frisky when they choose to be. A very, very agile animal. Just going to keep track of the time. Yeah, we're doing all right. Oh, yes. And there we go on. Now, this is just a commentary. I put it in because several times when I've been down tucked on the water's edge, hidden amongst the vegetation, hoping in fact for a beaver to show up, I've had its relative, the water shrew, come, and one has actually run over my Wellington when I was down there one day, but I haven't managed to get a photograph of it yet. So the water shrew is more charcoal, dark grey, almost black in colour, with an almost white tummy. And it's the only mammal in this country that we've got with toxin in its saliva. So that's still on my to-do list, to try and get a shot of one of those. And hedgehogs, we've got a few of those. You may know that the village of Woodbury has got a very active group that are trying to encourage the hedgehog population in the area. And in fact, in East Budley, we've got a lady who rescues a lot of underweight hedgehogs and makes sure they're fit enough to be safely released in the garden. And we are privileged to have one that comes and goes. It goes a bit more than it comes in our garden, but we've got one there as well. So, and this is here to tell me now that the polecats are coming up next. So if I give you a little bit of a background to these polecats, I knew there were 1 or 2 in the area. I had come across one that I thought it was, well, it was dead. It was close to the side of a road, and I thought it may be roadkill, but when I poked it with a stick and things, I couldn't find any broken bones. So I wasn't sure, and I left it alone. And I'd had a couple of glimpses of things that I thought weren't stoats or weasels. It was too far away from the river to be mink, but I wasn't sure. And this particular day, I walked for quite a long way, and I was a bit grumpy, to be honest, because I'd seen wood pigeons, I'd seen crows, I'd seen a few pheasants, but really very little else. And I'm perhaps half a mile or 3/4 of a mile from home, something like that. And suddenly, amongst dense vegetation in an overgrown hedge, I hear a lot of commotion. And my instant reaction was, oh, well, it's very probably a rabbit bolt into a hole. But the noise kept coming, and I thought, that's odd, perhaps a pheasant with chicks. And I thought, no, it's too noisy. Lots of things going through my mind, because I'm always interested in noises or movements. I don't understand splashes in the river or anything. I didn't understand this. And I could see about 30 or so yards above the hedge, in the direction the noise was moving, there was a farm gate. So I thought, well, if I can get up there quickly and quietly and hide amongst the vegetation, whatever it is should come out, and I'll just see what it is. So I'm tucked in place and very surprised. This is what started to appear. Now, just down here, you will see that there is a thigh bone of what I think is a rabbit. So this was obviously a place where they had a fairly regular circuit, and then slowly all this happened. This is the shot that won the Countryfile Calendar. And then they moved around a little bit, and then they were on their way. And as a wildlife photographer, I was really delighted that these animals, they came, they had a look round, and they left, and they didn't know I was there. And I think that's what wildlife photography is all about, if at all possible. So now this is the first of the shots from a previous calendar. So this is a little vole. And I thought, because it was out in the open and it was fairly close to me, that it must be sick or injured. But then I could see it was feeding greedily on blackberries. And I thought, well, sick or injured animals don't feed greedily. So I then realized that it wasn't really hanging on with all its feet. And I think it had eaten a bit too much of the overripe fruit and it was a bit too relaxed. This was a field fair taken during the Beast of the East, on one of the rare occasions when we had snow in the area. The light was terrible and my camera said to me, gosh, you're joking, I can't take a photograph in this. And I said, look, old chap, you've got to. This is a once in a not very often opportunity. So that was the field fair. The shoveler duck, or drake, when it flaps its wings, is quite a pretty bird, and we don't get a lot of them down on the river and the scrapes, but we do just get a few. The goosander with duckling is a duck that's doing particularly well on the river at the moment, and 2 years ago, one female managed to bring up 10 ducklings. Now, I can well understand that they're not very popular with fishermen, when I read that each duckling, to get from newly hatched to fledging, needs about 30 kilos, that's some 66 pounds of fish each. So if you've got 10 of those, and you've got a few other goosanders around, and you've got herons and egrets, and you've got otters and things, that's kind of quite a lot of pressure on the local ecosystem of the fish. So I wouldn't want to be a fish in that area, really. We do well with pheasant, but it's really nice to see a cock pheasant display into a hen. A little bit unfortunate, she decided to ignore completely his gestures, but it made a nice image for that particular calendar. Now, as a lad, oh gosh, probably of 10 or 11, this was a bird, the hawfinch, that I always wanted to see. But I had to wait some 60 odd years. And then I did read in an RSPB publication that it was a hawfinch year, and there were masses of them in the country. They were coming in from Scandinavian places, so they were tending to come to the east of England. But I thought, well, you never know. So I keep walking around, keeping an eye out. And I was absolutely astonished when, within a few hundred yards of where I live, in the local churchyard, I come across nothing less than hawfinches. And there was a flock of probably at least 17 there, but I can't be certain. Reed bunting does well down in amongst the water reeds. They do breed down just below Whitebridge. Great spotted woodpeckers, they do well too. Night yars, now they are quite a common bird, but locally common and scarce elsewhere. You can spend many half days looking for those birds and never seeing them, but they are around, and it's particularly pleasing. Here we've got a couple of juvenile birds, still not quite ready to fly, so still very vulnerable, but nonetheless able to make a nice photograph. Here we've got a male great spotted woodpecker. So this is in the churchyard as well. Now these birds have learned that once a month the church volunteers mow grass paths around the wildlife areas in the churchyard, and that exposes the ants' nests. They've got a few favoured perches, so if you're in the right place at the right time just before they come down to feed, you can get a really nice shot of what is otherwise quite a shy and elusive bird. This year's calendar, so here's a few shots of that. That's exactly what it looks like on the front cover. We get a few hundred geese, almost always Canada geese come down. They come down late June and July onwards. And in amongst them, always look carefully. We do get a number of other species. This happens to be a grey lag goose. The helmeted guinea fowl, now I think these are very probably captive released birds that have been released by a gamekeeper who knows that they're really shy, wary birds, and they're good at alerting pheasants if there's a fox or a buzzard about when they're first released from their rearing pens well before the shooting season starts. A young wren here, and we would know it's a juvenile because we can see this beak gape, the yellow at the back of the beak tells you it's a juvenile, and that's so that when it opens its mouth to be fed by parents, the mouth is much bigger to push in more food. As it's just fledged, over the next week or two, that will slowly regress and disappear as it converts to being an adult. Particularly pleased to see this butterfly, a brown argus, a very scarce species, and normally associated with chalkland, really. So to see it down on red sandstone, not really sure what the food plant of the caterpillar would be, so we're still trying to find that out. But there are definitely several colonies in Otterton and one down by Budley, quite close to Whitebridge, and I've even had one of them in the village churchyard as well. Now, a stonechat. So this is a bird when I was a lad that used to whiz off to Africa all the time, but we've got some that now overwinter here, and they do tend to breed more up on the commons and up at Otterton, but they are around all the time. And now this is very unusual, but a couple of other photographs I decided to put in would be for the 2023 calendar, which I'm rather thinking that a Dartford warbler of some sort we will probably put in there. And just a couple of weeks ago, when the River Otter was in flood down on the marshes, when they were covered in water, we had Egyptian geese come in for the first time. So that was really nice little bonus. So that's the calendar broadly covered. So now we'll go on to raptors. I'm just checking the time. So peregrine falcons, they do breed on the cliffs in several places. Have to be a little bit reluctant about how much detail we give where and when, because there has been suspicion that some pigeon fanciers might be putting poison down, but they are there. This was during courtship display, and now we've got an independent juvenile, and it is taking a pigeon. Now that pigeon certainly isn't a wood pigeon. It's not a stock dove, it's not a collared dove, so I suspect that was a partially exhausted homing pigeon, and a juvenile found it easy pickings, and it didn't take long to dispatch the bird and fly off with it. Hobby, it's a bird that's incredibly difficult to photograph. It's frequently, when it's feeding young, chasing dragonflies, and it's moving so fast, it's a bit like a large version of a swift. Very difficult, but when it comes into the country first and it's down on the River Otter, it actually starts hawking mayflies. And of course, mayflies do fly a lot slower than dragonflies, and you can actually see, if I can just bring in here, that it is actually catching mayflies in the air. Red kite comes through occasionally. As far as I know, there's no breeding attempts in the area. I think they're all probably juveniles or second summer birds, but they may stay days or weeks, but they don't stay long. They pass through. More likely to be seen up on the commons, but they come down into the valley as well. Buzzards do particularly well in the area. There's a wide range of colours, so this is a particularly pale individual that I chose here. And then here's a much darker one. So same species, but just variations on a theme. And then a few other shots of buzzards. The only time I've ever taken a buzzard in flight looking down on it rather than up at it. So this was when the farmer was ploughing a field and it was after worms, and it had to move just briefly as the plough moved round. There's the same bird taken off and coming into land. This one, it was a particularly frosty morning, so the air was cold. I suspect there was no thermals. This buzzard was being a little bit lazy. It didn't want to move and use up a lot of energy. So it just stayed there looking in hope for something about. So I moved down very gently, very slowly, no threat of us all, as best I could. And it let me get quite close, take a nice photograph and walk on by without being bothered at all. Now, buzzards, if you actually Google the skull of it, you'll see that about 25% of the space in the skull is taken up with two eyes. Those eyes, they say, can see a mouse at 50 yards. So if you want to photograph buzzards, don't think they won't see you. You've got to find another way of getting around the problem. Moving on to kestrels. Here we've got the male kestrel, which is the one with the grey head, a bit smaller than the female. And here's a female. So she was perched up in this tree, and I could hear a couple of walkers coming along talking quite loudly, and I thought they're going to flush that bird. If with a bit of luck she's going to come my way. I'm just waiting, and I managed to get that shot. Soon after, she landed in a tree where I managed to catch up with her, and then eventually she had a prize, which I think was a park-grown rat, and she was determined that nothing was going to see her eat it or get any photos of it, and I was equally determined somehow or other I was going to get a shot of her with her prize. So that's how we got that one. Here we've got a nest of kestrel chicks in a natural nest hole, and just here you can actually see the fifth bird down in the bottom center, a little bit smaller than the rest. And about 3 weeks later, very early in the morning, just as the sun rose, the birds did fly. All 5 managed to fledge. It was quite interesting. They actually used their talons while flapping their wings to climb up into the branches of the tree. I didn't stay very long, and I left them get on with it as soon as I could, but it was nice just to see that they'd managed to successfully fledge young. Sparrowhawks are doing particularly well in the area. This is a small female, a small male, and here's the female. Interesting fact about sparrowhawks, there's a bigger difference in size between the male and female than any other species of bird in the UK. And it seems that when the male is hunting food for the female, that when she's on a nest or she's got incubating eggs or tiny chicks, he can catch lots of small birds without too much problem. And as soon as the chicks begin to grow and become more demanding, Mum can come out and hunt a range of bigger birds that haven't been touched without any problem. And here's a juvenile bird very interested in the sparrows around a bird feeder. Now here I've managed to get into a position where the bird's in the sun, it doesn't have a clue I'm there, I'm in the shadows, it's not even worried about my camera shutter on silent chunking away, which is quite nice. It thinks something's going on, it doesn't know what. Another murder coming up, I'm afraid. This is what sparrowhawks have to do to eat, and without a whole range of gory shots, which I chose not to put in, but it didn't take long before this bird was really demolished, and that was probably within 7 or 8 minutes of it capturing the bird. Here we've got a winter roost for tawny owl, and I knew the tawny owl liked coming out in the sun and sunbathing a bit, but it wouldn't do it all the time. And it took me weeks before the penny dropped and I realized why. It's because the angle of the hole and the angle of the tree meant that it was the afternoon when the sun was on it. But with the prevailing southwesterly wind, it didn't want to sunbathe when the wind was blowing that way. So it waited until there was a bitingly cold northeast wind and it was completely in the lee of the wind, and then it would happily come out. The snag then was it dropped off to sleep. So what I then had to do was make a little squeak just to get it to open his eyes enough to say, what on earth was that noise, while I could get a shot of it. Here we've closer to a tawny owl, but now when it waits until the sun sets, so the lights pour, it perches near the trunk of a tree underneath the canopy, and it's very difficult to get a shot of it, but at least you can see what it was. And tawny owls do particularly well around here. And here's one that surprised me a bit. It was probably 9:30 in the morning, but this bird had come out and caught this small rodent, and I'm sure it was feeding chicks very nearby. Barn owls come and go a bit. That they have bred at Otterton before, but I'm not aware of them breeding in the last year or two. We in the last few weeks have just had one come into the area. So it'll be interesting to see whether it spends the winter here and then whether it finds a mate and whether it finds a suitable nest site. It is actually using an artificial nest box that has been put up for it, which is quite helpful. And here it is with prey for the growing family. Little owls used to be here. This is in a local farmer's barn, but I haven't seen one for several years. So that's one that I'm really keeping a lookout for to see how they're doing in the area. And just very occasionally we get a short-eared owl come through as well. It's just a winter bird that passes through. I can't say I've seen very many very often. Always worth looking out for something a little bit different. Now, when you see a bird, well, it sort of looks like a buzzard, but it's not quite right. And instead of gliding effortlessly up in the sky, it's quite low down hawking. It's got a characteristic white rump and a bit of an owl-like face. This is a hen harrier. So that there are just a few birds that, as far as I can tell, roost up on the commons, and then they come down into the Otter Valley around the surrounding farmland looking for small birds and rodents. And here's a sort of owl-like face and a more distant shot upon the common of a male hen harrier. So a very different bird, they are around. A few really poor record shots here, but this is actually a juvenile raven and it's being mobbed by a second summer goshawk. So there are goshawks in the area. Very shy, elusive birds, very difficult to see. This is a pair of second summer birds, and this is about the best I've done with them at the moment. They're so secretive. They're woodland hunters, and they really only come out and show either in the spring when they're doing their early courtship, or as the young fledge and learn how to catch their own food. Novices amongst the watchers here tonight, I've put in a few shots of gulls because a number of people sort of dismiss gulls as, oh, well, they're difficult, they shouldn't be bothered with. But in fact, it's not that bad. We all have to start somewhere. And for would-be photographers, herring gulls in particular are here all the year round. They're not that shy. They're not that fast moving. So it's a good subject to try and practice your camera skills on and see if you can get some nice activity. Even herring gulls can surprise you. So they do pass water as well as solid material, which is something I didn't know. Quite a serious predator. So here it's found a mallard duck's egg and it's making very short work of it. Here we're down by the mouth of the river as the tide is beginning to go out, and this herring gull has found an unfortunate crab that stood absolutely no chance. Herring gulls do nest very close to Budleigh Beach. There's a cliff they nest on, and the most confident dominant birds are nesting first, and they're about 8 or 10 feet down from the top of the cliff. And then there's a hierarchy all the way down. And those that are either subadults or most subordinate birds either nest on the ground just above the high tide line, or they don't nest at all. So you can see how important it is to try and keep dogs under control and be aware of breeding where you wouldn't expect it near Budleigh. Keep an eye out for all big birds, and seagulls would be no exception, for coloured bird rings. So they may not look very pleasing, but if you can get the information from them and pass it on to the British Trust for Ornithology, they will return information to you of where the gull was, or whatever the bird is, was rung and how it was traveled in the lifetime between the time it was first rung and when you've actually seen it. And you can get different colored rings on different birds. A couple of shots now, just to we want to start looking at gulls. Just think big ones, middle-sized ones, small ones. That's kind of okay. Now, the middle-sized one, the herring gull, is the one that's here all the year round. So if you see something much bigger than that, we know we've got a different bird. And equally, something much smaller than that, another different bird. Another shot of the same. So large, middle, and small. Now, if you suddenly come across something that looks like this big one, the greater black-backed gull, but it's actually a bit smaller than a herring gull, and instead of pinky legs, it's got yellow legs, it's just telling you, well, there's something different. And then you can go and look it up and you'll find it's a lesser black-backed gull. These small gulls, they are a little bit tricky because this is the gull in its winter plumage, so it's lost most of its dark head. Well, here's the bird at takeoff in its summer plumage, and you can now see this sort of dark chocolate colored head. You'll also note it's got black, very obvious black wingtips. So you're now used to, yes, it's a small gull, and I know it's got this dark head, and I know it's got black wingtips. But when you see one, well, this one's got a black head, it's actually got white wingtips. We can see it's just a different gull. And this is a Mediterranean gull. When you're able to see them side by side, you can actually see the black wingtips on one, the white wingtips on the other. You can see the bills bigger and redder on the one at the back. They're different, but it is more easy to miss them. And if this is a typical sort of scene, and if you just glance at it, oh, they're black-headed gulls, but actually, if you look in amongst them, they're not. They're a mixture of both. And this particular morning, this is just down by the bird hide at Budleigh Salterton, there were 17 Mediterranean gulls in amongst the black-headed ones. Now here we've got a black-headed gull, but winter plumage, and it's found this small flatfish, which it really struggled for some while to swallow, but eventually it did. And then you get a same bird picks a crab like this, and you think, well, look, there is just no way this cannot happen. But of course, it's surprising what wildlife can do. They're quite able to do all sorts of things you wouldn't expect them to. Here we've got a fulmar. So this is now the smallest member of the albatross family, and you see this funny structure on its nose, and that's because a lot of the time it spends out at sea, needs to drink salt water rather than fresh water, and it excretes salt crystals through there. So we've got a few pairs that do nest on the cliffs down near Budleigh, and here are a pair up on the cliffs doing a little bit of courtship chat to one another. Coming on to herons now. A heron is quite a serious predator, and they can surprise you. So on this particular day, this is Budleigh Cricket Field, and it was under a few inches of water. The heron looked like it was fishing. The tide was coming in, and I'm just thinking there can't possibly be any fish there. What on earth is going on? And of course, it was a poor, unfortunate mole trying to avoid drowning. So to try and save its life, it came up to the surface, only to find a heron was waiting for it. Here I put in a heron and an egret to show the difference in size. So the little egret is considerably smaller than a heron. I put this in because it's one of the first shots I took, and I was so keen to get an image of this white little egret that it was only when I got back and put the thing on the computer, I completely missed that there was a kingfisher in the photograph as well. So when you're out looking for wildlife, really do not just look, but see what you're looking at as well. And I'll make several other references to this later. So here we've got a little egret coming into land. This is down by White Bridge, showing nicely its black legs and its yellow feet. I think they're bright yellow because when it stands in amongst the mud obviously covers those feet, and after a minute or two, it'll raise one foot and shake it a bit, shaking the mud off, and that bright yellow movement will frighten any small fish or anything living hiding near it, and the egret will catch it that way. Here it is with a ragworm and catching fish as well. So here is a nice shot of the bird in flight. Now, so this is an adult bird. So we've got the really dark beak. We've got the fluffy bits on its tail and the yellow legs. I put this one in because this one is a younger bird, so it hasn't quite got as dark a bill and the feet aren't quite as dark, but you can see the difference between that and this one, which is obviously a very different bird. So this is the cattle egret. We just get a few of them around here. This would typically be more often seen in Africa on hippos or zebras, something like that. But there has been a breeding colony established on the Somerset levels, and through the winter it does come down into our area, and it's almost always among the cattle. It's one of the birds that actually doesn't like the water very much, as far as I can tell. And it's very keen on worms. Here it is. And this little bit of beige on its head is absent in the little egret, and it develops even more in its summer breeding plumage. Here we had 4 or 5 of them in amongst the cattle, and I put this in because this one here is the adult with its bright yellow bill. Now this is a darker bill, so this is a juvenile, but we've got this little short stocky legs and things, so you can see it isn't the little egret. And then you see this one here is completely different again. So now we've got a bright yellow bill. This is a bird as big as a heron, if not slightly bigger, the great white egret. I've only seen 2 or 3 down on the River Ever, but it does come down. This one happened to come down just below Whitebridge, just before it was flushed. And even a bird as big as a heron and pure white can actually drop down into dense vegetation, and I can't find it. I don't know whether other people can. Cormorant, these are doing well. They breed round on the cliffs as well. Here we've got a bird in its breeding plumage. They come into their breeding plumage very early in the year, and they lose that by about June. You can see, although it sort of looks like it's actually quite a pretty bird, sometimes they even get bored with me taking photographs of them. And unexpected with wildlife. Quite often this happens just before they take off. Now, I suspect they know that it's a waste of energy to take off with something, extra weight on board that you don't need. So a useful indication that you might be able to take the bird taking off. And here we've got, just below Whitebridge, managed to catch an eel. And I thought, if I just had a beak, I don't think there is any chance that I would be able to take that eel. But I suppose it took about 3 minutes to subdue it, but eventually it won, and the eel lost. And here's a bird that we really didn't expect to see, a very scarce visitor to our area. It's a glossy ibis. One year we did have 17 come in. It's normally a bird of Africa. It has been breeding in Spain, and they're coming up into France. So we get the odd one here as well. Now this is a flocking bird, but this was one on its own. And what happened here was, it was in amongst a flock of rooks feeding down in the marsh. And I didn't really notice it, didn't expect to see it, but a buzzard came over low and put all the birds up. You suddenly see that one's got long legs when it shouldn't have, and so then you wait for it to land and you try and maneuver yourself into a position where you can see what it is, and I managed to get these few shots of it. And on the wrong side of the sun to it, so it's not particularly good photographs, but I was so wary about disturbing the bird that I'd rather do that than risk trying to get anywhere else and upsetting the bird. I had a phone call from a good friend one day to tell me there was a spoonbill down on the flooded marsh, and it was pouring down with rain, it was blowing a gale, and I thought, do I really want to go? Don't I? And anyway, it was a spoonbill, so I went. I got wet, the camera got wet, but I got some nice photographs of a spoonbill. And here it is actually catching a small stickleback. Just occasionally something really scarce dropped in. This was grey phalarope, and it was quite a confiding bird. It didn't seem to bother people. It wasn't worried. It just did what it did. It was quite happy doing it. So that was a real treat down by the river. Avocet, they come in as well. Always nice to see it. It's scarce on the River Otter, but it does come in. Now the water rail. This is a bird that you're about 100 times more likely to hear than see. It's shy, it's secretive, and it's noisy. Let one another know where it is in amongst dense vegetation. When it's in the river, at the slightest movement, noise, anything, it scuttles into dense vegetation. And it knows when it's in dense vegetation, you can't see it. But it hasn't twigged that every time it moves, it makes ripples. It can't go inland and it's not going to come straight out. So it's either going to go left or right. So if you're following which way the ripples are moving and you focus the camera on a gap in that vegetation, then as the bird emerges, you will see it. Here it is, the tide is about to go down and it hasn't quite gone out. And I think this bird was really hungry. So it was actively moving quite large stones to get little water shrimp and other invertebrates for underneath before it was easier pickings as the tide went out. Behavior that I really wasn't expecting to see. And then this is more typical. Bird has decided something spooked it in a hurry back to dense cover. Little grebe is a typical bird. If it realizes you're in eye contact with it, it will dive. So you've got to put some time and effort in to try and outwit it. This is a bird in winter plumage. This is the same bird in summer plumage. Here's one up by Whitebridge that has caught a little flatfish. Now this bird down by the bird hide, it caught that fish, but believe it or not, quick enough to swallow it before I could get a photograph of it. This is a while ago now, so I'm a bit better at it, but you've got to be really switched on to get these images. This was just a little while ago, though. So the bird on the left here, this is a little grebe, and you can see this one is different. It's bigger. And it's got the red eye, and it's a black-necked grebe. So that's a bird I hadn't seen before, and this one was a surprise visitor to the area. There's the same bird having a bit of a flap. The grebes don't actually breed on the river, but they do breed nearby. These birds were at Bicton Lake, between Bicton College and Bicton Gardens. And here's the same bird a bit later on. Now you can see it's got webbed toes rather than webbed feet. Everybody likes the kingfisher, I guess, and this is a juvenile bird, and I knew where it was perching, and I'm crouched in there. It knows I'm there, but it has decided I'm not really a threat, but allowed me to take a number of photographs of it doing different things. So it goes to show, although people talk this blue flash and you can't get close to it, with a bit of time and effort and things, you actually can. That's that. This is a nice young male, more preening, and in nice like how I'm just watching the time as I do these things so I don't run out of time. Kingfisher, not too bad. Okay. Now this is, the light's not quite as good, but I knew it was behaving a bit differently. And this is a bit like owls when they cough up pellets. This is about to cough up fish bones and scales that it's found indigestible. Now we come on to some insect-eating birds, again mayflies. So I have noticed a huge, difficult to be objective, but probably 15 or 20-fold increase in mayflies down in the river, I suspect, since the presence of beavers have been around. So birds that can take advantage of them are doing well too. And here we've got the pied wagtail at its nest, feeding young. And I got lucky that I knew a place where they seemed quite happy to have a bath in shallow water. And there was dense vegetation in shade nearby, and I could get quite close and get some really nice shots. And here's grey wagtail doing the same thing. Now here's grey wagtails feeding young. Newly fledged juveniles. And here, insects a little bit out of kilter, but I'll spend a couple of minutes just talking about this. So what happened here was that we'd had a bit of a flood event and most of the vegetation in the river had got flattened, but there were a few blades of grass that had been left upright. And all these male banded demoiselles were being attracted to it because they wanted the highest point to try and attract a female. I knew there were a pair of grey wagtails nesting nearby. It was nicely lit in the sunshine, and very close by was dense vegetation in deep shade. So I thought, well, if I tuck in here for a few minutes, I stand a chance of something quite interesting. Now, I'm always wary about birds when they're feeding young, and it's against the law to in any way disturb rare species, but I think for responsible photographers, it should apply to all species. They've got enough stress and hassle without us creating any more. So birds' welfare, first, second, third, fourth, fifth. Any sign of any unease of any sort at all, leave it alone, walk the other way. But this was fine, this was okay. And because the bits of grass have been protected by an obstacle in the river, the water going round the border was actually making enough noise to mask my shutter as well. And I eventually managed to get these shots. So here you see the grey wagtail, and it's eyeing up this damselfly here, and then it actually picks it out of the air. It does a somersault, knock it off the front, and then it picks it back down, and it bashes it about quite a bit, which I won't go into before it eats it. Here, the birds feeding other foods, and here's quite a large cricket about to be demolished by a youngster. Passing through, among cattle, our only migrant wagtail, the yellow wagtail, will be seen in the spring and the autumn. And there's a juvenile bird there. I've put in a raven just to show the size of this big chunky beak. I've put in a juvenile raven here, so you can just about see the beak cape here. So they breed on the cliffs. I think one or two pairs are breeding inland a bit as well, and I'm not sure whether that means they're doing well, that they haven't got enough nest sites out on the cliffs, but they are slowly becoming more common. And then I've got a number of shots of the carrion crow. Well, it's a very familiar bird, and as its name suggests, it will eat just about any carrion it comes across. But it's a very intelligent bird. It learns quickly. So here's one with a young slow worm that it's taken. And here's one with a mussel down on the beach. So I presume it's learned from watching the gulls to fly up in the air with this mussel and drop it down onto a big rock or a concrete path a number of times until the shell smashes, and then it takes the inside out. Here's one that really made a mistake. So the East Budley duck race, we had a little plastic duckling get away, and this crow thought it had a food. Unfortunately, I couldn't follow it to see the look on its face when it found it had got conned. Here we've got a crow taking a small crab. And here on a rising tide, a very high spring tide, a little vole got caught out, trying to swim for safety, and the crow saw it. And in no time, okay. And here's some good, strong evidence that crows, they're very switched on, and they can actually catch fish. So here they are taking minnows, and this rarely happens, but 1 or 2 days a year, when everything is just right, the minnows spawn. And this is the sort of scene you'll get. So the crow picks that up as quick as anything. And the downside of it is that there's so much food that it so quickly gets full that you don't get very long to take the photographs. Here we've got a scarce bird in our area, but they do breed. These were taken at Bicton Lake. Relatively newly hatched, so the tips of the beak are still showing the egg tooth where they came out of the shell, compared to a moorhen. A moorhen taking advantage of a damselfly hatch, taking food to a hen on the nest. And here the newly emerged chicks. I think these were relatively young parents and they were a bit over enthusiastic. They couldn't realize that newly hatched chicks couldn't possibly take the number of damselflies that they were trying to push into them, but they kept going. There's mum brooding a few of the youngsters. Bit of interesting behavior here. So these bulrushes are maybe 9 or 10 feet tall, and the moorhen is quite a clumsy bird climbing up there, and to go to considerable effort to take equals of pollen was behavior I hadn't previously seen, but it realized, I presume, that it was a rich sort of protein and it was happy to feed it to its chicks. For those more experienced birders here, a little bird, the spotted crake, a really shy, skulking, elusive little bird, and I've just put a juvenile moorhen, a well-grown one, alongside to give some idea of the size difference between the two birds. But you just never know in the Otter Valley what you might come across. Here we've got sand martins, so they are in the riverbank. This is a bit unusual because according to the books I've read, the sand martins always make a new nest hole, but this is actually covered in guano and it's a previous year's kingfisher nest. But they did successfully rear young there. And there's a bird up in the air. Oyster catchers are there, and I think we've got one pair that do breed near Budley, because when I was down looking at for herring gulls, nests and eggs, there were a pair that were very reluctant to leave an area, which is unusual behavior for an oyster catcher. So I left them alone fairly quickly because my camouflage gear that's suitable for hedgerows and fields is absolutely hopeless down on the seafront. And here you've got an oyster catcher actually opening a mussel and taking the contents out. This and the next shot weren't actually taken at Budley. This one was down at Exmouth and the next one is Topsham, but it just shows these colour rings that you can see. So this one was on a curlew, and this was interesting because they were able to identify that this bird had came from the Knepp estate in Norfolk, and it was one of 86 birds that were captive reared and had been released either on that estate or Sandringham estate. And this photograph, which was taken down at Bowling Green, was the first bird that had been seen away from the release site. So always worth trying to get those tags. So here we are, a number of shots at curlew. And curlews are quite interesting birds. When they catch the worm, they do take it to the water if they got a chance to wash it off before they swallow it. Here's a shot initially that looks like a lot of curlews, but when you come in amongst them, you can see, for instance, this one here, it's got a shorter bill, it's a smaller bird, and here's another one here. So these are wimbrel. So do look out for the difference between curlews and wimbrels. Don't ever assume it's just a common bird. Here they are out on the marsh at takeoff. Here they are passing by. Always interesting to note to me that almost always the birds in flight are in eye contact with you. They know that you're looking at them. There's one or two favoured spots when the tide's just right where a number of birds choose to have a bath. And when the light's right and the tide's right and you're in the right position, you can get some quite interesting shots of natural behaviour that you wouldn't otherwise see. They're quite squabblesome. They don't like sharing too much. Lapwings, only ever see them in winter, so we don't really get summer plumage options that much. But if you can catch them in the right light and the right sheen, they are really nice. We usually get 2 or 3 that come in down there. And I have seen 15 or 20 birds come and try and land alongside them. And the ones that have been down there chase them off. They don't want to lose the food source. During the beast from the east, a number of golden plover join the lapwing. These are down on Budley cricket field in the middle of winter. So winter plumage bird, but nonetheless nice to see. Redshank are quite regular winter visitors. And here, just so that you can see, this little bird here has got a very small crab, which is a bit unlucky. Same bird here in flight, the red shank. And now the next shot shows not all red shanks are red shank. So if we suddenly look closely, we can see the bird at the back has got a shorter neck, a shorter beak, not a very big supercilium or pale eyebrow above the eye. So the one at the front is a spotted red shank. When you see them together, it's pretty obvious, but when you just see them on their own, it's much less obvious. So although the breast is whiter, they are a different bird. So look carefully, don't make any assumptions about what's what. Now we've got a green shank rather than a red shank. We don't get very many of those, but just occasionally the odd one will drop in. Godwit, a black-eyed godwit. We get a few of those come from time to time. We do get the very, very occasional bar-tailed godwit, but I haven't got a photo of one at the moment. Fernstone, just a few come down in where the River Otter actually meets the sea down on the beach is the only place I've ever seen them, but not very often and not very many. We do get quite a few common sandpipers come in, and really interesting. This is a bird that would normally stay with us for the winter and then would whiz up into Scandinavia and beyond to breed in the summer. But I did come across a pair in summer plumage, late May, out at Tipton, St. John on the river. And whether that was a breeding attempt or very late departing birds, I don't know. So when you see this white triangle shoulder patch, that tells you it's a common sandpiper, whereas when you see a similar looking bird but without that shoulder patch, that's a green sandpiper. And we're really lucky in East Budleigh on our local brook. We have a bird that overwinters with us most years. Another scarce visitor, this is the field behind the cricket club, a ruff. Just the occasional one comes through. And very, very occasionally a wood sandpiper will come through as well. Another ruff. One that I've only ever seen down there twice, a curlew sandpiper, which can look very similar to the dunlin. The dunlin is much more common. We've had about 15 down there this winter. And this is down just behind the main pebble bank at the beach. And if you sit down quietly and don't make much movements, the birds will relax, and you can get some quite interesting shots of them, and in lovely light too. This is down by the bird hide, and I noticed a number of people with binoculars, and they glance out and they say, "Oh no, nothing about, don't think any more of it." Well, if you look a little bit closer, and then we're coming a bit closer again, actually, no, look, you've got an awful lot of snipe there. But they're so easy to miss. And if we go back, now you know the bird there, you can see all over the snipe. So when you're out and about and you're looking for wildlife, really do look, because they are brilliant at hiding themselves. And if they freeze, if they don't move, they are particularly difficult to see. When you know where they are or where they're likely to be, and you can catch them in nice light, then they're a bit easier. This is the place where the curlew was bathing earlier, and then the snipe wanted to have a bit of a bathe there as well. But they're more guarded, more wary about it. But here we've got one coming into land. Quite a nice reflection of one. Happily feeding amongst the reeds. And very occasionally they'll give you the chance to get one out in the open. Now, common sense says when you get a brown and creamy bird out in the grass, it should be very easy to see, and it looks that way here, but they are astonishingly difficult to see. They just look like a bit of dead grass or a molehill, and believe me, they're so easy to overlook. You're more likely to see them by movement. If it moves at all, it's not a molehill. A really tiny bird that just occasionally comes in down by the beach is the little stint. One way of telling it is the ring plover, which is itself a pretty small bird, is quite a bit bigger than the little stint. Oh, so here we've got the A ring plover feeding down by the estuary as the river goes out. One in flight. And then about as close as I've been able to get to one without worrying it. Back on the river a bit higher up, beavers do very well in our area. The books say that dippers only catch caddisfly larvae and things like that, but here they are catching a number of fish fairly easy. This is actually just outside Otterton Mill, and I was amazed how accomplished a fisherman this bird was. I'm just checking the time, 8:45. Yeah, okay, I better go on a little bit closer. So, whereas the juvenile dipper is only able to catch snails. Here it is showing itself well. A couple of shots, unusual that these dippers hold territories all the year round. So this is late October, and although the light's terrible, they really are fighting over territory, and one actually tries to drown the other before it sees it off. The world's only aquatic songbird, and down on the river at the moment, we've got three males that are actually singing down there. It is warbler, a bird a bit like the water rail. You're far, far more likely to hear than to see. This particular one had a bit of nested material. And here's one down in the reeds. They really do skulk down in the bottom of the reeds. Just by being patient and waiting, a couple of shots, I managed to get several partial shots for this leg ring. And from that, my bird rigging friend was able to identify it as one of two birds he'd rung the previous summer as males within 200 yards of where I took this photograph. So really good evidence that that particular individual was very site loyal to where it was brought up. And it is my bird ringing friend here now. I do spend a lot of time down by the river, and in all that time, I only ever heard one call from the grasshopper warbler. But he has now twice caught juvenile grasshopper warblers. And when he's got them in the hand and he's examined them, he's able to tell me that they are very likely to be locally bred birds. So it's really interesting, in spite of how hard you look and how much you listen, that you still might not know as much as you think you do about some of the wildlife that live here. A couple of really unusual finds. We had 13 European bee eaters fly through down by White Bridge. That would be April 18 months ago. And I was amazed, within minutes, they were able to work out where the local beekeeper had some beehives. The great grey shrike was a real treat, difficult bird to get close up to. The wry-neck passing through as well. Now, I've only seen these out on the coastal paths. I think they're there in part because coastal paths never have any fertilizers, any pesticides, no heavy machinery, no heavy cattle or anything like that mashing the ground up. Plenty of ants' nests and rabbits grazing those nests. But it is a coastal path, so they have to pay a price. And these are walkers, and that's what they do. And this is how close the bird will wait until it flies for cover. So that's the end of my birds. I'm just going to try and whiz through ever so quickly a few insects, and then that'll be done. So the common blue butterfly, not difficult to see. The orange chip, they're here in good numbers. There's one with its wings open, which they don't like doing very often. The Brimstone yellow compared to the clouded yellow. So they are different when you see them. One's got a green eye, one's got a brown eye, different shaped things. And here's the clouded yellow feeding on lucerne as this happened. Our only green butterfly, the green hair streak, and the white admiral. Should be up on the commons rather than down in the valley. But they are here and always worth looking out for. Hummingbird hawk moths, they're around. a few dragonflies. I'll just wait through them. So that was an emperor. This is a southern hawker, a 4-spot chaser. Just a little bit of courtship amongst the dragonflies, and then egg laying on the move. Here we are, mating behavior. And I think this emperor dragonfly was so well camouflaged that these little damselflies just thought it was something to perch on, and that's what they did. They just landed there, didn't seem to bother either of them. Here I've come in really close, so here we've got a dragonfly. You can actually see its proboscis has punctured one of the fruits of a blackberry and is sucking the sweet juice out. So although they will take sugary food in the autumn when they have to, they're really rather more of a predator. And this is the golden ring dragonfly, and here it is actually demolishing a bee, and quite a serious predator really. The beautiful demoiselle, the male here, displaying to a female in lovely light. They're down on the River Otter, but not in very big numbers. Here we've got a common damselfly, but if I just come in here, you can see even that has captured a little unfortunate greenfly. Hornets, they are quite serious predators here as well. And here is one that has taken a very large cricket, immobilized it, and then is tucking into lunch. And this is the last one, so I'm not too far out on time. The mint beetle. So this, I was down in amongst the water reeds and in amongst the water mint. One of these little chaps came along and more or less insisted I took a photograph of it. So that is my take on a quick trip through some of the wildlife that you might see down on the River Otter. Sorry, there's not much in the way of geese, ducks, or other things at the moment, but I wanted to show, like a curlew, doing 5 or 6 or 8 different things rather than just one stood there doing nothing. And that's the principle I've used throughout. So that's me done.
Thank you, David. That's brilliant. And who'd have thought we'd have bee eaters in the mix? I mean, the variety of wildlife you've captured is astounding. And it's not just about click and collect, is it? It's about seeing them doing what they naturally do. And so thank you so much. We've got a few questions. Are you happy to answer some?
Well, yeah, I'll certainly answer all the easy ones.
Okay. Well, I've got one from where have I put it?
Yeah.
Oh yes. From Joanna asking, do you know, are there many kingfishers, and do the mink cause trouble for them nesting?
Kingfishers do well, as far as I can tell, we'll say roughly from Otterton Road Bridge right upstream. Once you come below that bridge, that particular stretch of river does seem to be very much more prone to flooding. And the kingfisher is a relatively sort of high energy using bird that needs to feed very regularly. And I suspect that when the river is fast flowing and muddy, they find it incredibly difficult to catch their food. Now, I have seen them out in little tributaries and side streams looking for food in those situations. But very often the birds move on from the area, and then I don't know whether they starve or whether they find other suitable locations, but they don't seem to come back. But certainly the lower stretch of that river, most of the time you'll see kingfishers from June through to peak flood events, and not after because of that. Much of the time the kingfisher nests fairly high up in the bank, so I'm not aware of any particular problem with mink, although I suppose if an inexperienced pair of kingfishers tried to make a nest in somewhere that was relatively easy for a mink to get at, I'm sure it would take them.
I think they're quite territorial as well.
The kingfishers are. The problem I have is that when you get to see a kingfisher and then you see another one half a mile away or a mile and a half away,
Yes.
I don't know whether it's the same bird or a different bird, unless they suddenly have a real squabble and I think, oh, we've got a territory fight on here. But other than that, I've got no way of knowing. So it's handy if one or two have got bird rings on so I can identify individuals, or if it's got a wing feather or a tail feather missing or just something. But otherwise, I really can't tell them much apart. Although you can tell males from females. The male has got an all black beak. And the female is lower bill is red, and how you remember is she's the one that wears the lipstick.
That's clever. Thank you for those tips.
Okay.
Another question is from Diana, asking, do you use a tripod all the time?
No, I never use a tripod. 95% of my photographs are taken handheld. If I'm lucky enough to be either in a bird hide or there's a convenient tree, branch, wall, or anything I can rest it on, I will try and take advantage of it. But mostly, I'm using a higher ISO to get a higher shutter speed, so I need to worry a little bit less about camera movement.
Thank you. Andrew and Kate ask, is the information on bird rings just numbers?
No, it's a combination of numbers and letters and different colors as well. So sometimes you might get a red ring with white writing on, or it could be a red wing with black writing on. And there's a huge range of different colors. And so different sites will have different combinations for different species. And then different countries have different combinations as well, because they can be coming, don't just think they're in the UK, they can be from anywhere.
Okay, thank you. And you did mention that you can contact the British Trust for
Ornithology. They're the people I send my reports to, yes.
Okay, thank you. Sarah said, thank you for saying about the birds' welfare being the first priority. We need more people to share that.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. And I mean, there is potentially a bit of conflict, believe it or not, between bird watchers or twitchers, if you like, and photographers. That the twitchers have got big telescopes and they're looking, they can be half a mile or more away, and they get quite grumpy if camera people try to get ever closer to the bird and disturb it, which you can understand. And equally, the camera people get a little bit concerned if the people with telescopes are making rather a lot of noise because the birds are a long way off. And they're hoping that the birds are going to try and be encouraged to come closer. And in fact, one of the common mistakes people often ask me is, how close did I get to that hare or that whatever bird? And it's the wrong question. It's, where did I tuck myself away and how close did that species actually come to me? Because I always let it come to me. As soon as you try to go after something, you're causing a problem. Most species' main criteria when they wake up is not to become dish of the day. So anything that gives a predatory stare and starts chasing it, they become nervous of.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Can you stop sharing your screen? Someone's asked David. I think maybe we'll get a bit of picture of you then. So I think that's.
And how do I do that?
And everybody else, yeah.
So if I stop share, okay, yeah.
There we go.
Okay.
There's everybody. Right. There are
Hello,
lots.
people.
Where are the other messages, love? But
Yeah.
somebody asked what camera you used. Is that a trade secret?
Well, I'm happy to tell you, I think it's the wrong question. So I use a Canon 7D and I use a 100 to 400 lens, but I'd suggest that's about like me going to someone's and they give me a really nice meal. And I say, oh, that was so nice. What oven and saucepans did you use to cook it in? So you'd be better to ask about, well, what was the light like when you took the photograph? What were the camera settings you used and why did you use them? Because it'll tell you more about how to try and take a better photograph.
That's a good answer. Thank you very much. Very good answer. Look, well, just read a few of the comments. Absolutely stunning.
Oh, wow.
Absolutely fabulous. Thank you. That was wonderful. Amazing evening. What amazing variety. How far up the Otter do you go? That's the kind of the question.
Well, most of the time I'm on the stretch between Collerton, Raleigh and Budleigh.
Right.
But one of the things that COVID did teach me is that that lower stretch can get very, very busy. So I did venture up to places like Tipton, St. John, to try and reduce the public recreational activity from influencing quite as much of what I was hoping to see.
Thank you. So, I mean, I could go on, David. Obviously, lots and lots of people have really appreciated your talk and loved it.
Well, that's the main thing. So great.
Thank you. And also give us, well, just stunning revelation about all the things on the otter, or that, you know, the amazing variety of flora and fauna in this part of the world.
But you really have to look. I mean, they don't stand out and form an orderly queue.
No.
And if you want photographs of them, I mean, you do have to be patient and persistent and practice with the camera. I've never once had a bird or an animal say, "Oh, I'll just do that again so you get a second chance on check." It doesn't happen like that.
Has anyone got anything else they want to add or ask? No? Well, thank you. It's been excellent, enjoyable evening, and
Delighted you enjoyed it.
yes, thank you very much.